The 15-month wait-up period is officially gone. And no, I don't think this means HDB prices are suddenly going to shoot up. But I do think something quite important is going to change. Who is competing with whom in the property market? And depending on whether you own a 4-room HDB, a 5-room HDB, a condo, or you are currently looking to buy, the impact could be very different. So, what does this mean for you? Hi, I'm Joey. Let us first understand why we had this 15-month rule in the first place. Back in September 2022, the HDB resale market was running very hot. Resale prices have been rising strongly, and the government was concerned about the affordability, especially for the first-time buyers. One group they wanted to manage was private property owners entering the HDB resale market. Because generally, someone coming from private property may have greater financial means compared with the typical first-time HDB buyers. So, from 30th September 2022, private property owners generally had to sell their private property and wait 15 months before they could buy a non-subsidized resale HDB. And importantly, this was introduced as a temporary measures. Fast forward to today, the market looks quite different. HDB resale prices declined 0.1% in the first quarter of 2026 and followed by another 0.3% in the second quarter. At the same time, housing supply has been ramping up, and look at the number of BTO flats reaching MOP. Around 8,000 in 2025 and 13,500 this year, and 15,000 next year and 19,500 in 2028. So, with prices showing signs of stabilizing and more supply gradually coming into the resale market, the government has now decided to remove this temporary measure. So, what actually changed? From 28 July 2026, sorry, there's a typo here, eligible private property owner and former private property owners no longer need to wait for 15 months before buying a non-subsidized resale HDB, provided they are not taking an HDB housing loan. And here's another very important change. A current private property owner can now buy the HDB first and then dispose of all their private residential properties, including overseas properties, within 6 months after completing the HDB purchase. So previously, it was like, sell your private property, wait for 15 months, then buy your HDB. Now, for eligible buyers, it can be buy your HDB first, then sell your private property within 6 months. So now comes the more interesting question. Who is actually affected by this change? Let us start with HDB sellers. Before this change, private property owners aged 50 and above already had an exemption from the 15-month without period if they were buying a 4-room or smaller resale HDB. But if they wanted a 5-room executive apartment or executive maisonette, they generally still had to wait. So think about someone who has been living in a large condo or landed property. They want to right-size and unlock some of their housing equity, but they still appreciate having space. Previously, a 4-room HDB may have been one of their most practical options if they didn't want to wait 15 months. But now, they have more choices. They can consider a 5-room, an EA, an EM, and that means a potential buyer pool for these larger HDB flats may have just expanded. At the same time, 4-room sellers no longer have the same relative advantage when it comes to this group of senior right-sizers. And remember, more flats are also reaching MOP over the next few years. Looking at the historical BTO mix, 4-room flats have consistently made up of one of the largest and often the largest portions of new flat supplies. So, as more of these flats reach MOP and enter the resale market, 4-room sellers could face more competition from similar units coming onto market. But I wouldn't simply say 5-room or larger HDB flats prices are going up or 4-room prices are going down. Now, let's look at the HDB buyers. First-time buyers. A lot of buyers are currently thinking, HDB prices have already fallen for 2 consecutive quarters. Maybe we are entering a buyer's market. But here's something important. The overall market can become more price sensitive, while certain segments become more competitive. Because eligible private property owners can now enter the resale HDB market without waiting 15 months. And some of them may be coming in with significantly more equity available. So, if you are targeting larger flats, recent MOP flats, or attractive locations like nearer to the MRT, your competition may actually increase. Next, private property owners who are looking to right size. For this group, I think this announcement is clearly a good news for them. They are the biggest winner. Firstly, you might have to sell your private property first, find somewhere temporary to stay rent during the 15-month period and move on, then sell and then buy your HDB and move again. Now, for eligible buyers, that transition becomes much simpler. You can potentially secure your HDB first and dispose your private property within 6 months after completing the HDB purchase. So less temporary accommodation, less double moving, and much more flexibility. But there's one thing we need to be very aware of, that 6-month disposal deadline. Once you have committed to the HDB, you cannot simply hold on to your private property indefinitely while waiting for your ideal selling price. So the selling timeline and your asking price still need to be realistic. Now, what about existing HDB owner who want to upgrade from like 3-4 room to a 5 room and above? The buyer pool we are competing against for the larger flat may have expanded. Because private property right sizers who previously had to wait for 15 months can now potentially compete for the same property. And finally, what does all of this mean for the private property market? I think this is where we could potentially see movement in both directions. For owners of a smaller private property like a 1 to 2 bedroom condo, HDB becomes a more accessible option without the 15-month wait. Especially for owners who value having more space, some may choose to sell their smaller condo, unlock their equity, and move into a larger HDB instead. So over time, I will watch whether this leads to more resale supply and greater competition among the smaller private units. On the other side, we have HDB owners moving in the opposite directions. Owners who sell a 5-room HDB, EA or EM may have accumulated substantial equity from the HDB, and some of them may use that equity to upgrade to a larger 3 or 4 bedroom condo. So I don't see this policy as simply HDB demand goes up and private property demand goes down. Instead, I think we could see a redistribution of demand across different segments of the market. Smaller private units may see more owners considering a move into a larger HDB, or larger private units could continue receiving demand from the HDB upgraders. Of course, it is still too early to know how significant this movement will be, but these are definitely the segments I will be watching over the next 6 to 12 months. So, does removing the 15-month wait-up period mean HDB prices are going to shoot up again? Personally, I don't think that's the right conclusion. Remember why government is comfortable removing this measure now? HDB resale prices have moderated for 2 consecutive quarters. BTO supply has increased also, and significantly more flats will be reaching MOP over the next few years. The 15-month rule itself was introduced as a temporary demand control measure. So, removing it now suggests that the government see the market as becoming more balanced and is comfortable giving homeowners greater flexibility again. But right now, it is simply too early to know how significant these effects will be. And here's the most important part. Property impact is hyper-local. Some estates barely have any 5-room supply, some areas have a larger number of flats reaching MOP, and some estates have EA and EM that simply cannot be replicated by new supply. So, whether this announcement benefits you really depends on what you own, where you own it, and what you are planning to buy next. If you want to know how the removal of the 15-month wait-out period could affect your particular estate, comment your area below, or drop me a DM and I will break down the numbers for you. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in my next video. See ya!